actually, this question that just came up after Bruce talked of how you combine social science and the design of socially intelligent ICT is in fact kind of what I'm going to talk about, because this project Q-lectives, which you've probably heard a number of people here saying they're involved in, that's exactly what we promised to do. Now, I'm not going to go into specific examples. You can look on the Q-lectives website, you can look on my website and see some papers and things. But in a way, I used this, this workshop, and particularly the questions that Jeff sent out, as a kind of challenge and an opportunity to step back and try to think how we might try to combine these approaches to answer, and how I might answer these questions. It's a rather silly thing to do, to try to answer these questions in 20 minutes, but I'm going to have a go. You can assess how successful these answers are. So I'm taking a bit of a step back. So the first question then is, what is ICT-enabled social intelligence? And the first thing that occurs to me is to ask, when asked that question, well, what's social intelligence? And I think Bruce was answering that question from a social scientific point of view. Well, here's one answer. Social intelligence is the opposite of antisocial stupidity. Okay? Hence, maybe game theory is not much use in some of the things we want to do. That's a bit of a joke. I'll come back to that. So, more seriously, let me try to put this on one slide. So what does social intelligence mean to me? Well, I ask another question, and I will stop doing this question upon question after this, otherwise we'd be here all day. The question is, well, what do we mean by intelligence? And so my background originally is artificial intelligence, and there are no simple answers there either. But let me throw something out here, and I think this is reasonable. I would say that a lot of people would see intelligence as doing the right thing to achieve goals, given the information at hand. You might call that reasoning, you might call it rationality even. But also there's another aspect to intelligence, which is learning from experience in order to improve performance, adaptation and learning. I think Bruce was talking about there. So, you know, there's a classic quote, which, you know, a demonstration of madness is doing the same thing and expecting different results. So this is kind of roughly what I think is reasonable to say intelligence embodies these kinds of processes at an individual level. But what's meant by social in this context? Well, let's say there's some population of intelligent entities, we might call them agents, and that they cooperate to achieve their goals. And that the goals of the agents may or may not conflict, and that their interaction is restricted by some spatial, temporal, informational constraints, who you know, where you are, how you can interact. So if we bring those two together, what is social intelligence? Well, I think that we've seen this with the examples actually, like Flickr and other things, which is that it's about feedback mechanisms from individual micro behaviors to collective macro outcomes, but also, of course, from those collective macro outcomes back to individual behaviors, as Bruce was saying, that as we use systems, the collective outcomes modify the individual behavior. And what we really want, I would claim, why we would call something a system socially intelligent in that context, is that these feedback processes lead to often emergent, and I won't go into what that means, emergent, maybe not planned, not fully understood, complicated, collectively good outcomes in the context of, say, tagging. People tag things, and what we end up with at the end of this is a resource that we can search and we can create folksonomies, which in general are collective goods, are collectively good for everyone. And I'll come back to how you might define collectively good if I've got time later. Now, I think Bruce was talking about Adam Smith. I'd claim that Adam Smith, in his famous work, called this the hidden hand of the market. And that's in the context of kind of classical markets. The hidden hand, that through individual kinds of intelligent kinds of behavior, you get collective goods. And I think what we're talking about here is many other new interesting mechanisms other than markets that do that kind of thing. So let's go back to question one, having said that. What is ICT-enabled social intelligence? Well, I would say social intelligence in which ICT plays a significant role in the social mediation process. It's in and facilitating those feedback loops. And the agents and users are possibly computational agents and services. So it might not just be that you're communicating through ICT and mediated, that you may be interacting with other intelligent agents that themselves are not human beings, they could be ICT. And that this enables the emergence of collectively good outcomes through fostering cooperation with the right incentives, resolving conflict through norms, rules, policing mechanisms, producing fair and productive allocation of resources, and I'll come back to how you might define fair and productive later if I've got time, and filtering out bad adaptations and spreading good adaptations. Here I'm kind of getting to the idea that the social collective or a socially intelligent ICT system can adapt from within. Consider, say, Facebook apps, where users, by seeing that their friends download an app that they like, will also be informed of that. And this can create a positive feedback process where one assumes good apps spread and bad apps don't spread. When a bad app spreads by lying to the user or manipulating in some way, it makes the news. It's a breakdown of the system. So the question then is, if we take that kind of perspective on social intelligence, and in a way, Bruce's talk was all about this kind of thing. So I'm glad, because I can be very brief, but allude to the fact. We might say, well, what theories exist on social intelligence? Well, in fact, in a sense, all kinds of theories and studies of social phenomena could be claimed to be looking into this social intelligence, but I'll give you some that are just kind of interesting in the context of the work that I'm doing in Q-Lectives anyway at the moment. And one is evolutionary theory, particularly sociobiology and evolutionary game theory. Things like reciprocal altruism, kin selection, group selection, cultural group selection. Bruce talked about Boyd and Richardson. We can look at some of the work of John Maynard Smith, who founded sociobiology. And there's a lot of very interesting work there showing how individual adaptation processes can lead in a kind of unthinking way to socially intelligent outcomes. How positive social behaviours, you might call them strategies or norms, can emerge through simple evolutionary processes, which also are kind of like simple learning processes. Also, there's been a lot of work in common pool resource theory and well, less theory and more empirical analysis. So Elinor Ostrom's famous works on common pool resource governance, how actually people in the real world govern common resources collectively and productively to produce these socially intelligent outcomes. More recently, I got interested in this idea of, there's a whole strand since the Enlightenment, going back to, I don't know, Rousseau, David Hume, all the rest of it, Hobbes, social contract theory, which is essentially a more rational, top-down kind of way of thinking about how you resolve this issue between, how you create the correct feedback loops, if you like, to produce what is collectively good. So essentially, social contract theory comes from this idea of how you could use reason to derive just social norms and laws that everyone rationally would subscribe to, so at least agreeing on what you want to do. And you might be interested in something called John Rawls' theory of justice, which is a recent incarnation of that, which I'll talk about if I have time, and how this could inform engineering of socially intelligent ICT. And of course, we have economics, markets, peer production, Bentley's wealth of networks, this new kind of non-market, seemingly non-market-based way of coordinating people. There's also a whole set of work in symbolic interactionism, in social science, ethnomethodology. You could go on. Of course, a lot of these have not been applied in ICT systems, but I believe, as was said, we need to be aware, not just aware, but to involve people in our design process who know about these things. They are useful. So there's a load of theories out there. How they're applied, it's another question. So this is what question 3, I think, alludes to, which is, well, are there engineering principles for creating socially intelligent ICT systems? And I would say this is an active research area that we are focusing on in Q-Lectives. And we're at early stages, but we say, okay, let's see what we can do. What would a design principle for socially intelligent systems look like? What level of abstraction could it be presented at? This is just my particular interest. There are many things going on. This is my particular interest. Of course, we already have socially inspired design patterns in deployed P2P systems. So, I mean, in a simple way, you know, the tit for tat, the direct reciprocity process in BitTorrent, the golden rule, it's in every major religion, and actually goes back, funnily enough, to something like social contract theory. But anyway, is already, it's a social idea which manifests itself in almost all social systems, and it's directly inspiring a P2P protocol which is highly successful. Whether it's successful because of tit for tat is another question. Of course, we can use indirect reciprocity approaches. There's been a lot of work on indirect reciprocity mechanisms in evolutionary game theory and other kinds of approaches with computationally specified agents. And we see the emergence of credit and point systems in various socially intelligent ICT systems, although whether we really know how to apply this and how we would describe these in an abstract way, we don't know. Something I'm kind of interested in is group selection, and that, as was talked about earlier, the idea of multiple groups and how they grow, how they split, how they merge, individuals who move between them. Certain processes in evolutionary game theory can show how, in quite simplified models, you can create high levels of cooperation, even with selfish kinds of behavior, using these group selection approaches. Also, altruistic punishment and self-policing processes have been quite well explored in human systems, and also there are some models. I think that these could be useful. So if you want to see where we are in Q-electives with this, not that anyone ever reads these deliverables, but you know, maybe it's worth doing. If you want an overview, you could see this deliverable from Q-electives, which attempts to present these at a very high level as socially inspired design patterns. At a very high level, and it's a start, I think. Of course, what was alluded to and what's very important, what we really need is to explore real design patterns, is to directly deploy these on big systems, make measurements and do real, if you like, social science in that sense, and then modify them. So I do have a bit of time. Okay, so just to throw something out, and all this is a cut and paste from Wikipedia, so I don't claim to be an expert, but just give you an idea of how focused some of the questions are that have been tackled by social scientists, political scientists. Elinor Ostrom's famous work, she synthesizes from actual observations of people solving common pool resource dilemmas. That is where you have shared resources and you need to allocate them in some fair and collectively good way. Actually identifies 8 design principles, as it were, of how you would design such communities. Now, I think this is something that I think Nazareno's looking at more than I am in Q-electives. I don't know, but I think we should be aware of these, and I think these have analogues in distributed and non-distributed socially intelligent ICT systems. So we have proposed design principles coming from social science, which we can use. Another important factor that was mentioned by Bruce was the idea of how do we produce realistic cognitive models? I mean, what kinds of models do we currently have of how users behave, how people behave in such systems, particularly when they're being influenced by those systems themselves? And it's true, as far as I know, we don't really know. And in order to produce realistic models, we need to kind of move away from an overcommitment to some sort of a priori, or however seductive it is, either whether it's an evolutionary or a rational model, an a priori commitment to theoretical models. Because in fact, when we do large measurements, as we've seen, when we do large measurements, we find that, you know, these simple kinds of utility maximizing or simple imitation models don't account for a lot of user behavior that we see. So empirical measurements suggest that we have complex, heterogeneous, and adaptive populations. But progress can be made, because in a way it's the first time we have the ability to go out and collect large data sets where we can actually deploy something to change the context of the user and then see what happens. So we could do real experiments, essentially, rather than just passively observing. Although a lot of the a lot of the current work on measurements is a kind of passive observation, but of course if you change those, you can create real experiments with a hypothesis and everything. So of course we need large-scale deployments and measurements and an empirical experimental approach. I don't think anyone's disagreeing with that so far, which is certainly something. Now, back to my current interest, and then I'll finish. Question is, everybody, I was saying earlier, you know, what social intelligence is lots of individuals kind of somehow producing through their individual behavior collective good or commonly good outcomes, you know. And the question is, what does that mean? Well, if you fix it in a game like, say, The Prisoner's Dilemma, it's mutual cooperation or something. But who says what's good? That's the question. What are the collectively good outcomes that we want to achieve for a given target ICT system? So if we sit down and say we're going to design an ICT system and say that system is going to educate the world for free, okay? Why have we come up with that goal? And what other goals do we want the system to embody? Forget how we're going to design it. How do we, in some way, objectively, if that's not, or at least in an agreement, in a rational way, come up with what's good, define what's good? And we could, I think, use this social contract theory as engineers in order to decide what's good. Not just somebody paid me to do this, or I think people will like this, but more like taking a step back and saying, in a principled way, what does the system want to achieve collectively? And so, you know, Rawls's argument in a book called Theory of Justice is to use a device called what he calls the veil of ignorance, which is a bit like generalizing reciprocity in a way. It's like generalizing the golden rule to a whole society. And it basically works something like this. It says, assume that we wish to specify the kind of society that we think is just and good, that we want to achieve, right? But we stand outside that society and we don't know what role we ourselves would play in it. We're ignorant of our endowments, knowledge, capacity, and position that we would hold. We don't know who we would be. We would be someone in that society, but we don't know who we would be. So the question then is, given that veil of ignorance, what rules and norms would we accept as just and fair? So what would we accept as collective good in that context? So because it wouldn't be the case that we'd say, well, you know, the rich should get richer. I don't think that would be rational in that context, of course. We could argue about it, we could debate it, and that's the point, we could debate it rationally, and that's the kind of idea of social contract theory. And I think that, you know, obviously, if you're designing an intelligent system, there are some analogues with this. We wish to specify requirements of a system that will structure interaction, say, between peers. The protocol could run on diverse devices, they can have diverse goals, capacities, and user behaviors. But say we need 1 billion users of the system to make it a success and get rich. Then we need to ask what collective goals we can define such that different devices and users would accept and run it. It has to be in sympathy with what they want. So you might think this is far-fetched, but you hear terms like do no evil or make the world a better place or even something like this thrown out by people who want you to join certain kinds of society or certain kinds of visions of society. And the reason for that is they're appealing to this concept. They're tapping in, I think, to intuitively this idea. So I think that, and then I'll finish, just essentially, currently, intuitively, or maybe not so intuitively, ICT system designers, intelligent system designers, and certainly P2P systems designers, are essentially doing this in their head and debating this, although they might not think they're doing social contract theory. And that's the end.